Hi, I'm Nick Rains from Leica Camera Australia. I'm always talking about shooting in RAW, but sometimes you just want to shoot JPEGs, and the D-Lux 7 has some really interesting JPEG settings which I'd like to explore in this video. This little camera has been with me for many years, or its predecessors. I've had a few of these. This is the D-Lux 7, the current model. I'll just show you a few pictures I've taken over the years, and then we'll get into some of the JPEG settings. So this first image is from Western Australia. Just, again, beautiful light, just a simple snapshot essentially. Then we've got Colne Cathedral, and this is using one of the settings in the camera to get a high contrast black and white effect, and it has a little bit of tweaking in Lightroom as well beyond that, because I just wanted to clean up those edges, but fundamentally that's straight out of camera. Then this is a close-up of some leaves in England. This is the close-up ability of the camera, and again in England, just capturing that beautiful light. I have done a little bit of work in Lightroom with this image, but fundamentally the black and white side of things is straight out of camera using the black and white filter settings. India, straightforward picture, telephoto 75mm lens, just grabbed the shot as it happened, no particular tricks here. This is Windsor Castle in England, again straight out of camera, JPEG, no adjustments at all, just straight out of camera. Vietnam, looking straight down, black and white conversion in camera. Worked pretty well with a slight sepia tone. This is Australia, just a dawn on the coast of Moreton Island, I believe. Again, straight out of camera with a little bit of a saturation boost. Iceland, one of the big waterfalls that you can see with a little figure there. That's 75mm end of the lens, so looking pretty good. And this is back to Australia, and there's the sunburst effect, which I'll be talking about a little bit of detail later on. But at the end of the day, those were shot with this camera, or one of its predecessors, using the JPEG and RAW settings. Now I must make it clear at this point that I virtually always shoot either RAW only, or if I want to use some of the effects in the camera, I'll shoot RAW plus JPEG. The reason I do that is because RAW is always going to give you the best potential quality later, but you have to actively make those adjustments and do that post-processing using Lightroom or Photoshop. Now if you don't want to do that, and you just want to have the camera produce good images that you can share on social media later, then of course JPEGs are going to be more convenient. And there are some ways that you can set the camera up to give you some different effects. Now, I have a bet both ways. Some of the effects in camera are quite nice, and they certainly are quicker to do because they're done in camera and it's all finished. But I also might want to use that picture later if it just turns out to be amazing. So I want to capture the raw data as well. So that having been said, there are some quite interesting settings deep into the camera which I want to go through now. Let's have a look at the back of the D-Lux camera, and you'll see it looks quite confusing. There's an awful lot of information showing up here, but what I'm interested in is this little mark here where it says standard. This is the photo style. So if I just go into the menus here, you'll see on page 1 of the top menu item, photo style. I'm going to enter into that, and you'll see at the top it says standard. Now as I move with the rocker switch across left and right, you see it changes: vivid, natural, monochrome, 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 scenery, portrait, custom, and then back to standard. And if you watch carefully, you'll see the colors all change slightly, particularly in monochrome obviously. And this is just a different recipe of color, and it's not obvious what that recipe is. So what I like to do is to go to custom like this, and then if you use the down rocker switch, you can go to contrast between -5 and +5. You can go to sharpness, and you can go to noise reduction, and you can go to saturation. So you can set up your own recipes, and up to you what you do with these. Personally, I find the most useful ones is to leave contrast where it is. Sharpness I want to take down, maybe to -4. Then noise reduction. Now noise reduction is a little aggressive on this camera, especially at high ISO. I've done some tests and it's a little bit smeary, so just turn that down a little bit. And then saturation, up to you where you leave this. A lot of it depends, as I've said before, on whether you want to do any post-processing to your picture. Now, if you want to do a lot of post-processing, you are better shooting raw. But if you want to get it straight out of the camera, reasonably close to what you want, this is where you would set your particular taste. Okay, and once you've set your personal, recipe, you hit set, and it's now in custom. If I come back to the screen here, you'll see it says custom here. If you were paying attention earlier, you might have noticed that when I went through from custom to standard to vivid and natural, the next one is monochrome, and there's some extra functions down here pop up onto the screen. And there's some really cool little features here. Let me just show you. First of all, you've got the same contrast, sharpness, noise reduction and color tone, not saturation this time, color tone. And that is just to give it a bit of a blue, you can see that, or a little bit of a warm tint, a little bit sepia-like. But the important ones are the next ones down. Look. This is the filter section, black and white color filters. And as I go through those, yellow, orange, red, and green, and then off. Can you see here, the color relationships are changing. And this is exactly the same as if you were shooting black and white film back in the day and putting color filters in front of the lens. And it changes the relationship in the sense that red things with a red filter get lighter, blue things with a red filter get darker, and so on. And this is a really nice way to get a really good punchy black and white effect. And I find the red is the best one. It's the strongest, but it's also the best one. So that's really neat. And one more thing at the bottom, you've got this option of doing grain, low, standard, and high grain addition. Now, your mileage may vary with this one. Personally, I'm not a big fan of adding grain, but sometimes it could be useful. But you can have a play with that and just see what you think. I would rather add that in post-production than anything else. And of course, if you're shooting RAW plus JPEG, as I think I've said before, you still get your normal RAW file and you get your JPEG with the effects applied. So as a monochrome shooting camera, it's really neat. And you do have a couple of other ones. If I go back to the filter settings here, you've got monochrome high contrast with the same settings down here. So that's even more sort of beefy version of the same thing. And you've got high contrast plus, which is even stronger again. So you've got some really serious black and white effects in. If I go down to this one here, the filter effect, and go to red, that's going to be very, very punchy indeed. So really neat. It does a really good job. I've used this quite a bit myself when I've been shooting RAW plus JPEG, and I'm very pleased with the results. So that's how you change the photo styles, okay, and this is how you set up your own custom one. But what difference do those settings make? What does the difference between high and low saturation or high and low sharpness really mean? So let me just show you some pictures here. This image is the contrast setting. The left hand one is the minimum contrast, and the right hand one, as you see it on the screen, is the maximum contrast. I haven't bothered with a normal contrast because I'm sure you can imagine what it would be like halfway between the two. I would be very hesitant to change the contrast too much. If anything, I would go on the low side, because it's much, much easier to add contrast later if you decide there's not enough than it is to reduce contrast later if you decide it's too much. Now that does assume that you have the ability or the inclination to do some post-processing, and I think at the end of the day, pretty much any image editing software you might use has got at least basic contrast brightness adjustments. So I'm going to assume that there's the possibility of making a tweak later. So I don't want you to overdo it at this point when you're shooting JPEGs, and there's particularly when it comes to sharpness, and I'll talk about that in a sec. But with contrast, I would err on the low side with an eye to increasing it later if you need to. Don't overdo it at this point. Then this is saturation. So on the left-hand side, it should look distinctly duller than the right-hand side, which to my eye looks a little garish. So same with contrast. It's a lot easier to add saturation later than it is to reduce it. And I would tend to probably stay maybe just a little bit below the normal, or maybe on normal with saturation, because you can overdo it. And some people like this effect, and some people find it just a little bit too overcooked. But that's what the difference is between -5 on the left and +5 on the right. Now when it comes to sharpness, this is an interesting one. This is the same image taken on the left with maximum sharpness and on the right with minimum sharpness. I think I've got those swapped from the previous two pictures because the left-hand one before was on max, but anyway, on minimum rather, and on this one the left-hand one is on maximum. But anyway, the left-hand one is maximum sharpness and the right-hand one is minimum sharpness. And it's pretty obvious that the left-hand one is a lot crispier than the right-hand one. But now here's something which is very important to remember. The sharpening effect is baked into the file. And if you ever made a print nice and big off this camera, you'd find that the sharpening effect is also magnified as you enlarge that image. So let me just zoom in a little bit and you can see very clearly, I'm just going to bring my mouse into the image here or make a little mark there. Can you see around the outside of the word Leica and Ernst lights there and Vet's light here, there's kind of a white fringe around it. And if you look very carefully along this highlight on the edge of the camera there, you should be able to see grey, thin black line, thin white line, then grey, thin white line, then thin black line. I'm not sure how well it will come up in the video, but I think the white fringing around the word Leica stands out quite well. And the right-hand picture, you can't see that. And that white and black fringing is what makes it look crisper. That's what unsharp mask does. And the problem is that it's baked into the image and you can't remove it. You can sharpen things more, but you can't sharpen things less once you've done the sharpening. So in-camera sharpening, there's no way back from it. That's why I suggest that you actually reduce the sharpening when you're shooting pictures, again, with an eye to sharpening them later. Now, again, if your output is specifically for iPad or for a phone or for social media, probably okay to leave sharpening on default, which is 0. But if you think you might want to do something with those pictures a bit bigger, you really don't want to over sharpen your pictures when you shoot them because there is no way back from that. So over sharpening images in camera is generally a bad idea. So if you want to keep your options open when you're shooting JPEGs, turn the sharpening down a little bit and with an eye to adding a little bit of sharpness later because you cannot reverse it. There is another really neat way to affect the output of this camera, and again it only works on JPEGs, not RAW files. That's to use the filters. Now if you look on the right hand side of the screen right there, you'll see a little tiny icon which looks like a painter's palette. If you tap on that, it will open up this little screen here, and at the top it's got an X on it, which means it's turned off. If I tap that to turn it on again, now we've got this sunshine effect, which you can see here. And I've got some settings that I can choose. So that's the sunshine effect. There's one adjustment and two adjustments. So for this particular effect, I can tap that. I can move around the star. It's not a starburst, it's just a sun flare, which gives like a bleeding of highlights. And it looks really good if you put that on the sky somewhere in the picture, like this one here I took of a tropical plant in my garden. It's not actually the sun, it's just looking through the leaves to the sky, but it looks like there's a sort of milky sun coming through. I quite like it. So you can move it around to wherever you need it to be in the picture. And also, if I set that, go back to the bottom one here, you can affect a tint. And obviously with its sun, the warmest one is probably going to be the best one. And I missed this before, you can also change the size of that flare by using the dial. So that's making it bigger and smaller, and that's moving it around the screen. It's really easy to use. So when you've got your composition in the viewfinder, and of course this is looking at my test chart here, but obviously in the real world you do it differently. When you've got your composition, you can then go to this filter and then choose where you want that sunburst to be. Really nice. And turn it off there, turn it off, and then turn it on again. And once you've got it turned on, and if you tap where it says sun, because that's the sunshine filter, you also get the option to dial through all of the different ones: expressive, retro, old days, high key, and so on. There's quite a lot of them. That sepia is quite nice. So if I choose that one, I can now adjust the strength of the sepia and the contrast. So I think it's really the same tint, but it's extra contrast that it's adding, and you can see those black squares getting quite dark or quite light. So probably in the middle is about right with those. And then turn it on and turn it off. Now I should also point out that this only applies to JPEGs. It does not apply to RAW files. If you're shooting RAW plus JPEG, you'll get a normal RAW file and you'll get a filtered JPEG image. If you are shooting only JPEGs, we come out to my menus, filter settings, turn them on. You'll see there's a line here that says simultaneous record without filter. That can be turned on, and that means that if you're shooting only JPEG, you will get 2 JPEGs, one with and one without the filter. So if I turn that on, then you can see it's available to me now, because if I come out to the main screen, you'll see at the top here, there, little icon there, that's because I'm only shooting JPEGs. Then I'll get 2 JPEGs, one with and one without the effect. Okay, well, there's a lot to unpack from this camera, as you can imagine. There's a lot of quite deep settings in here, and I haven't actually referred to a few other ones as well, which maybe I'll do in another video, but I just wanted to really get over the idea to you that there's absolutely nothing wrong with shooting in JPEG only if it suits your purposes. And if that's the way you want to go, there are some controls in here which allow you to customize the image to a certain degree and make it, make an image which appeals to you. First of all, the photo styles with their limited range of adjustments, contrast, saturation. There's also one called tone and sharpness, but the tone one is just a warm to sort of blue to warm look, so cool to warm. It's very subtle, so I haven't really got into much detail with that. Remember, all the settings that you see available on the back of the camera, as you change them, the preview image changes at the same time. So it's very easy to get a sense of what those adjustments do, because you can see it on the screen at the same time. If you want to go further, you've got the photo filters, and they can be applied to a JPEG as well as shooting a JPEG without the filter effect, so you can have a bet both ways. And there's 22 different filters there, some of which to my eye are a bit not very useful, shall we say, but a couple of them like really useful. That sun effect I do like, the sepia effect's really good, the black and white effects are really good. I think the what's the other one I really liked, the miniatures effect, have a play with that. I'll leave that for another time, but that's an interesting one. So there's lots to play with, but do try and shoot the double JPEGs so that you don't actually have to commit to that, because you might decide later you don't like it. Anyway, there's a lot of sophisticated options deep in this camera if you choose to delve into the manual and the menus. So I'll leave that with you to play with, but very, very nice camera, lots of different ways to shoot. And again, don't let anybody tell you that shooting JPEGs is the wrong way to go. It might be your correct way to go. It's not going to give you the best possible quality from the camera, but that best possible quality might actually not be what you need. What you actually might want is convenience, and JPEGs are nothing if not convenient.